Hello everybody and welcome to the last of our small video lectures here for our course on doing design fiction based scenarios through animation based video sketching. This is just a few pointers towards the critique session that we're going to have where we watch and discuss your productions together, and some further pointers towards the exam assignment. How might you analyze, how might you better describe, and maybe choose some frameworks to basically analyze your productions here from the week. I have also prepared a few more examples for where in industry do they actually use this method. How can you actually maybe take your skills further from after this workshop? But basically, this is, so to speak, the end of this 5-day virtual sprint that we've been running. I've been really impressed with how you have just jumped aboard all the digital platforms, all the techniques, and really managed to do some great things, even though that you have been dislocated and collaborating only through digital media. It has been impressive. And I do think that hopefully you agree that you have also, all of those of you that I have talked with, have actually managed to go through these objectives that we presented in the initial part of the week's lectures. That is the knowledge about how to use narratives in the design process, that you've been experimenting and working with all these video and animation formats as a sort of temporal design material. And as I've seen already, that many of you have already posted your first temporal sketches and shown me how some of them are near future scenarios, some of them are a bit farther out into these possible world scenarios in the future cone. And hopefully this leaves you after this week with a good foundation to walk into Dan's workshop in whatever sort of format it will end up being, depending on where the corona situation develops into. But just for now, I just want to reiterate the question of the expected amount of sketches you are to do. We have this requirement of the 3 to 6 rough video sketches. But of course you can do more. I talked with some of you, and some of you have already created 6 videos, so you will definitely manage to make more. But don't panic if you only have 3, don't panic if you only have 4. It is not the amount, it is about how many interesting novel design representation and design problems have you actually been able to represent through this medium in this week. So even though that I write here 3 to 6 rough videos before making the final video might be one of the 3 to 6. It might be that you say, okay, this one is actually the one we now believe is the best representation. Or it might be that you merge more than one video together into a final one. Or that you just pick and choose ideas from your previous ones and create a new one. Or you create an entire new one from scratch because you just figured out a much better idea. But what we're all going to do is that on Friday, tomorrow, we're going to watch our sketches together and give some feedback. And that feedback can of course be used for you to reflect upon in your papers or at the oral exam. So the exam will basically be both based on the written reflections and on the video concepts themselves. So make sure to take notes of all the feedback you get tomorrow, because you can definitely use it in the exam. And now about the virtual presentations. I'm going to post the link in the end of the day today to Thursday on both Moodle and on Discord for where the virtual presentations will take place. We will still connect through voice, so I'll be able to talk over Discord, but we might end up using another channel where we can sort of all watch live synchronized versions of your YouTube videos. And thus also tomorrow, well before 1 o'clock, maybe already 12:30, make sure that you export and you upload all of your productions to YouTube, and then send the link to me on Discord. So I will be the one sort of arranging all the presentations, so we only have one place that we need to all log in and watch the productions. So export, and do reserve at least a half an hour for it to export and upload to YouTube, etc. Especially if you have larger files, longer scenarios with lots of effects. It can take some time to render. But speaking of effects and speaking of fidelity, remember also from now on and until tomorrow the prime rule of doing it fast, not perfect. And that also goes for tomorrow. That even though that one of the sketches might not be completely done, then just upload what you have, send it, and let's discuss it. Better that you get some feedback and reflections than sit and hold on your concepts until you think they are polished and done. It is all about creating some design representations, not pieces of art here in this workshop. I hope that is sort of being emphasized enough now. So just to put it on form here, send it to me on Discord before 1 o'clock, and at 1 o'clock you'll get 5 to 10 minutes to present. So you can either just play all of your videos, or you can write a few sentences that you want us to read before, or you can actually connect on Discord and actually tell us something verbally if you want to do that. But you have only 5 to 10 minutes max. So maybe you don't want to show us all the videos if you have more than 5 to 10 minutes of videos, for example. And that will leave us some room for having a couple of minutes where we can give you some feedback and ask some questions. And take note of each other's ideas. How are they expressed? How well is the concept communicated? Is it easily understood in terms of the narrative? So you are ready to actually give feedback to each other. So it won't just be me criticizing, giving feedback, but you will also come into play yourself in the groups. And I have this model here. This is basically the difference between what we call design critique and traditional critique. That is that we actually use this as a way of creating a more elaborate feedback loop in our sketching process. So it's a good thing to basically get institutionalized, that we do this constantly when we do design. That instead of just proposing new features, new ideas, we start with these 2 steps of observing what did we actually see and why did we see this in the sketch. So this is basically the reality check. Did we actually understand what was portrayed in front of us? And if not, then why maybe? The next thing is then, okay, what is the potential of this idea? So are there any things that you would like to see elaborated more? Are there any things that you think, okay, would this actually be good for the user? What if the use case was this? So that's where we basically help the groups explore their concept further. And then we can, of course, begin to develop the idea. Could we take this idea even further? What would we add? What would we suggest of changes? So only then, as a third step, we begin to actually develop the idea. Up until then, we just try to help the groups to actually develop or observe and reality check and explore the potential of the idea they have chosen to represent. So it is all about feedback, and don't be afraid of showing your hands tomorrow and participate. It is not something that will be part of the examination, but of course you can use all the feedback. So make sure to write notes along the way, and because you can definitely use it when writing this paper essay, which should be 5 to 10 pages long. Use APA for references. You can see the template up on Moodle now, and I have arranged it from sort of a template of a research paper. So I don't think of it as much as that you're doing an essay for the study here. I'm thinking about it as if you were to go out at a scientific conference for service designers and describe your findings from creating these service representations. So both in terms of the methods you used, how they worked, but of course also in your way of saying, okay, this is my sketch of a new service system design. And thus, of course, also then use plenty of visuals. And remember to reference your video sketches also with links to YouTube or Vimeo. So, a quick few reminders or remarks in terms of the final sketch here. First of all, we could look at this as sort of a checklist. Because basically what this has all been about is that we've been using video and animation as sort of a medium to create these deliberate uses of diegetic prototypes to suspend disbelief about change. So that is the design fiction, where we show our hand, we show what we want to deliberately explore, We create these diegetic prototypes, so we should clearly see what is your design actually, what do we put into this world, and how do you actually create a believable scenario, and is it clear what kind of change that you're actually proposing. So that's the first checklist. Do you actually portray this as a diegetic prototype which is deliberately used to suspend disbelief about change? And of course that can be thought about in this storytelling framework. Are there some clear characters? Do we understand who the characters are, where they are at the different, where does the plot actually take place? Are there multiple touch points? Are there different stakeholders? Do we show the backstage or only the front stage of the service? And are there explicit subplots that's also exploring the ethical stance? So that is, okay, is this only the ideal situation, or are there actually moments in this design journey that you created where something might happen that wasn't beneficial for the user? And how would we avoid that? Or is it just a thing to address that design often has these gray areas? But remember, think about these subplots. How do we actually take this ethical and critical stance towards our own design? That's an important part of a design fiction. Okay, and another part that is important when we do design fiction of service design is also to sort of balance between where are we actually? Are we focused a lot on the touch point itself, or what happens between the touch points at the meso level, or are we elaborating it up into the macro level of showing the entire blueprint of the service, both the front stage and the back stage, where all of these different things are sort of pieced together in a more abstract way? And what video and animation can do is that it can easily transition between these levels. So we will often probably see that you will have moved between different levels of representations throughout a workshop like this. And another thing, of course, is I know some of you have also chosen to make sketches where you kind of show the present, what has happened in the present. That could be argued through with the outwards model, where you basically say that is our alternative or our lost future by showcasing decisions made in the past. And I know many of you have created scenarios which are basically at different points in the not so far future, where you say, okay, some of them are really realistic right here, right now. Some of them demand a bit more technological development, so they're a bit farther out. And maybe you end up here in the last part of today or tomorrow to actually propose a scenario where you cut pieces together into an entire new scenario, which sort of is informed by all of this. And that points towards a thing that is really interesting is, can you actually address where in this future cone your concept are? Is it a possible scenario, or is it right down to the probable scenario, this will probably happen tomorrow and it's a actually preferable solution that could be implemented here and now? Or have you also dared, so to speak, to actually widen the scope a bit and say, okay, there could also be other plausible things that could happen in this design space. So with that in mind, the overall model that we talked about initially when we did talk video sketches is, think about all of these design fiction, these speculative design metrics, and then think about how you arrange in a way so we focus on, for me as an audience, what is interesting in what I'm seeing here, but also describe clearly why is it interesting. So that is, why is this actually a relevant service design problem? And then help guide, how should this change my understanding? What suspension of disbelief about change? What is the proposed change, and why is that a good thing? If we can do that, then we're essentially having had a successful both design fiction, but also a successful way of using video as a way of portraying design fictions. And I might add to this that based on the experience from the previous years, I have these sort of 3 pointers to give you. Make sure that your scenarios don't just try to argue. Don't just try to say, okay, and then they can do this, and then they can do that, and then you have this, and then you have that. Try to also emphasize, what is the user journey here? What is the story taking place? Can you actually create a story around your argument? And that goes into the second one, that don't just be logic about it. Don't just be that this is a good idea because it creates a value proposition for the user here, where they'll get a less pollution or more money or more time. Try to show it empathetically. Try to show how will that actually affect a change for the user. Can we actually show it instead of telling it? So that is the empathy, not only logic. And of course, since this is service design, even though focus is good, remember that when you talk about multiple touch points, remember to reflect upon, remember to address how this will work in symphony, basically. How will all of these components come together? And if you successfully do that, I would say that I think that you will have an easy way of addressing or sort of setting check marks with that your design fictions will then effectively have become something that has created a story world and something that has been diegetically prototyped within that story world, and you will have framed some clear questions that you want us to actually think about. What is it? What kind of discourse should we have from watching your video? And now, of course, this is not all of it will be you won't be managed to get all of this into the sketches maybe, but some of it could be analytically explained in the paper. Yeah. And I just wanted to add to you a model that I showed some of you from the supervision you got one-on-one. But this is a model, it's on page 124 in my book. And that's actually where I basically just begin to try to break down the different ways that I have seen sort of the perspective, the discourse, the intent, and the fidelity mix and match in animation-based design fiction scenarios before. And now the perspectives are basically from the very isolated micro level to user scenarios where we see sort of more in a meso perspective, and those are both from the present, from a future in a positive spin, and from the future in a negative spin, and from this macro systemic view. And the discourse, that is not the discourse we want to create here. That is the discourse that we use to tell our story. Do we tell it as a dramatic, traditional storytelling with a beginning, middle, and an end, and a curve of excitement happening? Do we tell it with a bit of humor implemented, which can actually be a good thing? Do we tell it instructional, where we sort of need to do it as a guidebook, a piece of technical marketing? Do we create it as a documentary, where we have a narration, we have scenes, we have sort of a storytelling of something factual happening? Or do we take it more natural, so really don't have any speech, having any music, but just try to showcase a situation happening without us really helping a lot with the focus? So that's the sort of the different discourses that we often see, maybe also in combinations that things can have. And then of course also, what is the intent? Design fictions can have different intents depending on who the audience will be. Sometimes they are very rough, very investigative, we call that. That is that you only use them internally. You use them actually just to depict some things and discuss things in groups. Sometimes then we begin to be more explorative, and often that is when we begin to say, okay, we begin to fill in some details. Well, what if this idea had this feature? How would that look? But it's still only primarily something that we use inside the design team itself. It is explorative sketches. Then when we do more polish on them, and maybe you don't even do that much in this workshop here, then we begin to add annotations, we begin to add sound, speech, different elements that make it easier for external persons to actually understand this. Then they become explanatory sketches. And if we begin to put, as we saw some of the design fiction examples which have seen in the other video lectures, when we begin to put on a more marketing kind of discourse, then we begin to have persuasive sketches. That is, sketches that are actually selling the idea instead of just explaining it. And then in the end, of course, we have fidelity. But I have chosen to sort of begin to both differentiate between fidelity as something that is visual, but also something that is temporal. So we can have high visual fidelity, but very little animation. So high visual, but low temporal fidelity. And we can have some very elaborated stop motion, which has a low visual fidelity, but can have a high temporal fidelity. And the way I'm sort of imagining this is that we can sort of map out, when we have our sketches, we can begin to map out, okay, what kind of perspective do we have, from what discourse do we tell it, what is the intent, and how is the fidelity actually mixed and matched, and how is that difference amongst the different scenarios that we have created here. So it's a rather simple tool to begin to try to map out. Maybe in your papers, how there is a difference between the different sketches that you actually made. And this is just one way of highlighting how that might be done. It's not a must that you use it, but I know some of you have asked questions which clearly points in the direction that you might be able to make use of this when you have to go down and actually describe in a exam paper how you created your sketches. So that was all about the presentation, the exam, and some further perspectives to how to write the paper. Now in the end here, I often get the question when we end the workshop, well, how can we use this outside of the university? How can a service designer benefit from this? So I just thought I wanted to show you a couple of quick examples here on at least how I have seen and also myself collaborated in some of these cases. Others are people from my network who've done this in different contexts, both service design but also other kinds of design practices. So the first one here is the augmented reality app that I showed you a short clip from the first video sketch prototype that we did in one of the first video lectures. But this is just to show you we actually did an entire service scenario before we began to actually develop this, where we tried to act out how would this actually work in the context of an aqua zoo. And we began to show this to stakeholders and collect sort of insights about what could the resistance be in the exhibition among the company's stakeholders. We showed it to users, and we began to actually have a lot of sort of feedback collected in this way. And let's just see it quickly here. You can see it's very rough in fidelity. It was something done, explanatory, not persuasive in itself, but it wasn't about polish, it was a sketch. So dumping garbage in the North Sea. And showcasing sort of the meso-transgression to the next movie spot point, so they were on this hunt for the next stop. And showcasing our plan for where in the oceanarium should these different spots then be. Later on in this specific project where we designed this app, we got some funding, and we were this was way back in 2012. So back then it was still pretty technically heavy to do augmented reality. And what we found was that halfway through the project, we found that we would be able to run this application where we live rendered video effects and animation effects on a phone live, where you could see the effects happening. We could do that on all iOS units back then, but we would only be able to run the application on 15% of the Android mobile phones that were on the market in Denmark back then. So we of course stood in a situation where the aqua zoo that we collaborated with, they wanted to reach as many users as possible, but we knew that it wouldn't be a good user experience, because we knew that the only way we could technically solve this on the 85% of Android phones would be that we recorded a clip, but you wouldn't see any effects. It would have to be post-produced, so you would have what our technical staff estimated would be 1 minute of wait time before you could actually see the effect. And now the director of the oceanarium, he said, yeah, that's no problem. We'll just let the users wait 1 minute. 1 minute is no time. We have them typically in a visit for 3 hours, so 8 minutes of wait time for 8 augmented reality effects is nothing. And we knew that it was essentially cost us nearly 100,000 kroners of development, and we could have used those 100,000 to make the app better. So I created this small persuasive video sketch here where I simulated what is 1 minute of waiting time if you don't see the effects live. So you can see here my simulation. I simulated. Now we press the record button and we wait 8 seconds because we record the movie, and then 1 minute of wait time starts. And thus we wait. We wait, and we wait, and we wait. And I know by now you're probably thinking like, and what I did was that I put this video down on my phone, and I took the director of the Oceanarium and took him down to the scene and actually simulated this as a real app. And more or less when it reached this point in the video, he said, yeah. You have made it so that it takes way longer than a minute. This is way longer than a minute. You're cheating me here, Peter, with this load screen. And then for dramatic flair, I showed him a stopwatch that I had had in my pocket, where it showed him that it was exactly real time. And at this point, there were exactly still 10 seconds left of the load screen before it actually ended up. So with this dramatic gravitas and this way of using the sketch in context, he immediately handed me over the phone and said, we don't do the Android version now then. That saved us 100,000 Danish kroners. And what we did with those was that instead we polished the app to be really, really good on iOS, and we bought 20 iPad minis that users could borrow when they entered the Oceanarium to actually have as a borrowing device and use during the visit. So we sort of saved the user experience by using this method. And now there are many other examples. Here's one from Sweden, a collaboration I only briefly was a part of, where Bonnier, the publisher, collaborated with Berg, a design consultancy, on the magazine of the future. They're a combination of a Swedish and a UK-based design studio. So what they show is both the end product, a tablet-based sort of newspaper magazine outlet, and they show this sort of augmented table way where you can collaborate around a table with projected layouts for the paper. And this is a really, really long vision video, but actually where they show this design fiction scenario of how will both the back end and the front end of this innovation project take place. And you can see they enact it as though they are already having this system. So they do this instructional discourse in a very high fidelity manner, but not to sell the idea basically, but to explain. This is an explanatory video, clearly. Another one is one from last year, where one of my previous students collaborated, he is at a design agency called Grimene, where they collaborated with Arla about starting up how to use speech assistants and AIs in the way we can cook at home. And they started out actually creating sort of these design fiction scenarios and then used them later on to inform the actual technical development, which was implemented in Sweden this year. Let's just see here, it's Carla from Arla, the concept is called. So you can see here, they basically try to also showcase how voice will work. So we emphasize with a little clever animation how a voice-based interface will actually end up working in this kind of context. And they ended up also implementing it. So here it was basically just to kickstart an innovation project that was going to happen either way. So hopefully that shows you that this way of using it as a sketch or a way to simulate some innovation ideas is actually also used in industry. And now the skills used here is not only limited to industry. This aspect of using some of these tips and tricks can also be used to make effective communication with users outside of a traditional service design context. Here's one of the most recent coronavirus papers from Danish broadcast television DR, in which you can see they actually used stop motion to make some really engaging infographics here. And again, you can see you could easily, with the skills you've obtained in this week, actually create this kind of supplements to a digital information platform as the website here, where they, in a really neat way, showcase animated how the coronavirus affects the body and what actually happens at the different stages of the COVID illness that you obtain. Everything is wonderful. It's just cardboard and it's just stop motion animated. So it goes to show that even though stop motion seems low fidelity, it can definitely also provide some value. And those of you who've used other animation tools online available or created with mashups of graphical elements you found could end up doing something like this one. This is one created by Wired, in which they try to deconstruct how fake news is actually shared. So that's actually, they deconstruct an entire service journey of how people in Macedonia, because of their low wages down there, actually ended up creating fake news websites, not because that they were a fan of Donald Trump, but because that they knew in this way they could earn more money on marketing placement than they could in an average salary. And here Wired basically uses really simple animation to break down a very complex service system that many people don't understand and think maybe fake news actually originates at a completely different place than it actually does. And finally, of course, we could also use this kind of things if we go out and want to crowdfund a startup idea or a product idea, using these things to communicate on platforms like Kickstarter. Like this one, a service to translate, a service designed to create a translation service. And there are tons of different Kickstarter videos to be inspired from here. But the important part here basically just is that many of these tools you have explored and seen in this workshop can be applied to make something with a little practice, of course. Something like this. So you can basically begin to participate in this visual industry. So again, don't panic that you can't run out and do this tomorrow, because there is no shortcut to experience. But there is this notion of that when you've done this a lot of times, you'll also see the production time is much shorter for you. You can do things much faster, but you also see that you become more comfortable in making things that look just a little bit better, and then can easily be tweaked into something that can be explanatory and persuasive and be used outside of the internal design project, even though that is also a really, really good thing. So this goes to show basically that we have sort of a range of topics here where we can use design fiction, where it can basically make sense. From these internal visions, you maybe saw the Google lecture, the movie that I referenced that you should see, or that would actually also be some of the more rough sketches that you created this week. Things that are primarily used for us as designers to communicate with each other about what is it that we're actually doing here. To sort of the middle ground where we begin to explore how will we actually communicate our design ideas to other stakeholders. And up until the extreme in the right side, where we begin to say, okay, what if we then had to sell our idea into an innovation project or into a Kickstarter? Basically sell the idea before we have created it, before we have funding. How will we then go about and use these techniques to basically create what we could end up saying vision videos? They show visions on both an internal and on an external scale, and that is sort of the ultimate thing that we can use this method for. It is to reflect upon this suspension of disbelief, creating this moment where we can actually make others sort of begin to think together with us about these what if design questions, both on the near term but also the bit longer term scope of whatever business we're going to work with. So hopefully it makes sense, and you can also read one of the papers that I have made online for you, the one called Return of the Vision Video, where I actually deconstruct together with my colleague a case from Land Rover and how we used social media platforms to gather more than 300 different user reactions, and actually had a lot of documentation for it, that we can use this also as a participatory medium to actually gather feedback from potential end users, which can be very valuable for the design project. I'll encourage you to read that if you want to investigate that option further. But this was actually the last piece of the puzzle that I wanted to portray for you, and I hope that you have had throughout this week a nice workshop, even though our workshop this year didn't look like the one in the background here with a lot of stuff happening in the studio. I at least think that from what I've seen, that the process has been very dynamic either way. You've made some great progress in both the tools and in the design ideas I've seen explored, and I've just been genuinely impressed with your way of sort of catching this ball in the midst of these corona times and actually create something rather nice out of this situation. So with that, I just really want to thank you for have been virtually a great crowd to teach and to quiz during these past couple of days. And I hope you have enjoyed the workshop and that you will continue to make some great design representations of your service designs also in the future. And if you should have any further questions or comments or need for some supervision on methods or etc. inside of this field later on in the education, don't hesitate to reach out and contact me if there should be anything. But without further ado, then thank you very much for a great workshop, and I look forward to see your final productions tomorrow. So see ya in a bit.